Welcome back to the channel, folks, and to another 28mm painting tutorial. These are Warlord Games Caesar's Legions. It's a sprue of 4 that I got free with War Games Illustrated, so I thought it would make a great project to paint these up for the channel. I'll be using my usual layering technique and my basic but still quite effective non-metallic metal. As always, I've started with my undercoats. These are going to be to a large extent the shade colours used, and it's German Camel Black Brown on most of the miniature, but the metallic areas I'm starting with German Grey. I'm now going to dry brush the German Grey with London Grey. We're going to create a non-metallic metal, very basic non-metallic metal appearance here. I do it this way because of the layering technique, but you don't have to. I find it works nicely with the layering technique, but you can just use metallic paints with a wash of black, for instance. Then I'm going to add some highlights very carefully with some deck tan, folks. I'm going to try and catch edges as much as I can, and remember, you can always go back and paint in some shading if you want to accentuate some deeper areas. So painting the armour on these guys is quite straightforward, and so is the red. You just have to pay attention to the folds and the creases. Here I'm starting with burnt cadmium red. That's going to be the shade colour, though in the deepest recesses I will still leave some of the German Camel Black Brown, and certainly around the edges of it where it's framed against the armour, for instance. Let's start adding the main colour, which is simply red. Not the group, that's what it says on the bottle, folks, it's just red. Now we're going to apply this over the burnt cadmium red. We're going to leave some of that burnt cadmium red as the shade colour. So this is our next layer. This way we're starting to create some nice contrast. And once again, just follow the high points, the folds, leaving the burnt cadmium red in the recesses, and we'll start to get some nice shading and highlighting. Next we're going to paint very small highlight layers here, basically lines, little highlights lines, and I'm using bright orange, but you can use scarlet if you're looking for something which is just a little bit more subtle. Now I'm going to apply this on the edges to help frame the red fabric. I'm going to apply it on the highest points of any creases, but also where appropriate above any shading. If you imagine lights coming down the way, creating shadow beneath the fold and a higher highlighted area above the fold. I'm using German Camel Medium Brown with a highlight of old wood for the leather of the belt and the trim on the shoulders of the armour. For the skin, I'm using a familiar palette that I use a lot, but with a slight change. I'm going to start with Saddle Brown, and I'm pretty much going to replace all but the deepest areas of shade here. There's not going to be very much of the German Camel Brown showing, and that in particularly applies to the face. Before moving on to the next layer, I normally paint the eyes. For some reason, I've not recorded it on this video, but check out the French Napoleonic Line Infantry video that I posted recently to see how I did that. The main layer for the skin is going to be Panzerese's flat base. Now, most of the figure that we've done so far, folks, we've been able to get away with just one coat of paint. You're going to need to take 2 coats here, and what we're going to do is we're going to build up the shape of the arms, the legs, the knees, the calf muscles, all these recognisable areas by applying lines and blocking approaches. And then in the second coat we're going to go in solid up all the layers itself, so it's nice and solid layer of paint, and also fill in so that all these blocks and lines are all joined up together. And then we're going to do the same with the face. We're going to paint the cheeks, the nose, the top lip, the chin, but not the bottom lip, leave that a bit darker, and quickly you're going to end up with something that people will easily recognise as a human form. Our highlight colour is going to be flat flesh, and we're going to apply this in very similar ways to what we've done on the red. You can see me catching the nose, the bridge of the nose that is, underneath the eyes where the light would hit it, on the ends of the toes and fingers. Right beside the shade colour, where the shade meets the main colour, that gives a nice strong shape that stands out nice and clear on the tabletop. And always put this on very thin, guys. Your brush may dry quite quickly when you're working on it. If that's the case, just keep refreshing it, don't put it on too dry. Now for some details, starting with the scabbard. Let's give it a black undercoat to begin with, and then we can move on to the sandals. And here we're going to use leather brown with a very small highlight of orange brown to create that worn leather edge that looks different from the colours we've used on the belt, even though they're very similar otherwise. And as I said, folks, your brush might dry when you're working with a really small brush. This is an insane detail brush. It might dry, so you've got to get the right balance of water and paint so that the paint smoothly flows off onto the feature you want to edge or highlight, but it doesn't flow off the feature. It just takes a bit of practice. The wooden shaft of the pilum, I am starting by painting it with old wood. Then when that's dried, I'm going to paint on some lines with any old kind of dark brown will do. Sort of thin lines giving the impression of a wood grain. And then when that dries, I'm going to wash that same brown colour all over the surface of the shaft. When that's dried, I'm then going to give it a bit of call it a dry brush, I'm not entirely sure, but basically bouncing a fairly dry brush with the original colour across the surface, and that way we're going to get a bit of depth, which suggests wood grain in what is an otherwise flat and featureless piece of the figure. Now let's move on to the bronzy gold type areas. Now you could just use metallic paints for this, but as I like to take a non-metallic approach here, basically a layered approach that sits in well with the rest of the figure, I'm going to use a shade layer of Japanese uniform, then a main layer of green ochre, and a highlight of deck tan. A small highlight, you can control as much of that as you want to put on. The more you put on, the brighter the metallic look will be. We're doing this on the helmet too, and the only bit of shade we're going to leave there is right in the cheeks, for instance, framing the face, around the back of the head, and just around the back of the lip that goes around the back of the helmet there. And a larger area, such as on the helmet here, you're going to need to use 2 coats. Onto the green ochre, and we're going to apply that over our Japanese uniform, leaving shade in, such as you can see on the belt there, on the edges of the trimming on the scabbard, and then we're going to have to be a lot more a lot more careful when we're working on the helmet here, folks. We want to try and create a bit of texture here. For instance, we're not just going to paint the whole helmet with the green ochre and leaving a bit of shade. We're going to try and leave some lines of Japanese uniform showing there, just to help create a patina. And then going in with the deck tan in very small amounts. Once again, the more you add, the more silvery, the more bright on the edge, for instance, you're going to create. But we'll just use it sparingly here, folks, just to try and give it a bit of a sparkle and to define the shapes a little bit more. Next, on to the black and metallic areas. So I'm using German grey, leaving a little bit of the black that we put onto the scabbard to the plume and to the pilum in the way that we've done before, so that we're creating a bit of shadow, a bit of depth. Now we can just paint things black, but it's hard to get shadow and depth. German grey is a great way of getting there. And then we're going to go in with London grey to create the highlights on the plume and on the scabbard, but we'll come back to the pilum in a minute. I'm painting the hilt of the gladius and the dagger with medium grey and a little highlight of deck tan. Remember to paint the straps and the hair around the back of the head here. Use similar colours to the leather we've used elsewhere. And then on to the pilum. Now we've got a dark underside to this already, so we're going to use light rubber, and we're going to apply it really quite wet, but trying to leave the shading colour around like the base and the tip of the pilum and underneath. And as I said, it's quite wet, so we want to put it on in a couple of coats, and then we're going to use some deck tan just to put a line along the topmost area of the shaft and the spike and the point, and then also on those little bolts that you can see that attach it to the wooden shaft. This gives us a very nice simple non-metallic metal look. Now the shield, we're not going to spend a lot of time. I'm just going to create the impression of something, in this case sort of the boards that might have been used for the shield on the back, no highlights, nothing else. And then I'm going to glue it in place, let that glue dry, and it will be nicely positioned for me to paint the front where most of the detail is going to be. So it's got an undercoat of German camel black brown. I'm now going to apply the red colours that we've already used. I've not got any decals for these guys, but you would apply the decals on top of what I'm doing. So starting with the cadmium red, it's going to take 2 coats here, folks, and I'm going to leave a nice framing, thin framing line of the shade colour there, the German camel black brown. Then I'm going on with the red, and you notice I'm kind of painting it streakily, painting little lines. I'm not wanting bold, solid edges approaching the outside of the shield, the outside rim of the shield, and I'm going to build these up in a couple of layers again. The multiple layers will help give that soft look to everything, and then there'll be some small lines of the orange colour as highlights on the top but not on the bottom. Then the bronze edge, the bronze boss on the shield, we're just going to use the same colours as we used for the helmet here and build up the layers. You can, as I said, have it more or less shiny looking depending on how much deck tan you want to use. So I hope that's a good demonstration of layering painting for you guys. It's something that looks really good on the tabletop. You don't have to worry about blending, any such thing. There's a wee bit of washing involved on the spear shaft, but you can make that as simple or as complex as you want, folks. I find it's a very solid process that allows you to get consistent results. So hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, subscribe, do all the good things for the channel, and it will also help me share these kind of videos to other people who enjoy the challenges and the fun of painting these lovely wargame miniatures. Catch us on the next one, folks.